Hello, my name is Ann Brazo. I'm the founder of MPN Advocacy and Education International, and we host a series of conversations with MPN specialists. And today, our specialist is Laura Michaelis, Dr. Laura Michaelis, coming to us from Wisconsin. And she has been a partner with us on so many other events, and our dear partner with Women in MPN, which we'll be hosting in September again this year, the 9th annual, which I can't believe. But Laura's going to talk to you today all about clinical trials. And then we will have an opportunity to answer any of your questions. And after which you will hear from industry partners. And it'll be a nice segue from what Laura shares with you to what our industry partners are up to regarding clinical trials. So please welcome Dr. Laura Michaelis. Hi, Laura.
Hi, I'm so thrilled to be here. I'm going to start by seeing if I can properly share my screen. Hold on a second here. And let's see here. Are you guys seeing the right version?
Yes, we are.
Beautiful. All right. So this is one of my favorite topics to talk about, and that's because clinical trials are really what's responsible for the fact that we treat myeloproliferative neoplasms a lot differently now than we did 5 years ago, than we did 10 years ago, and certainly more than we did 20 years ago, for example. Clinical trials was what made it possible for a lot of the novel agents, but also for us to learn more about how people's symptoms in MPNs behave, how people, what really matters to the patients is clinical, can be rigorously and systematically evaluated in clinical trials. And, you know, most people think about clinical trials where they're going to get a placebo versus a test drug, and sometimes that's the case, but there's actually a large amount of clinical trial typology, and understanding exactly what that trial means is good. Another thing I hear a lot is, well, I'm just going to be a guinea pig where you'll test some, you know, cockamamie intervention, but also that's not always true. So I think that this is a really valid thing to discuss in an educational context, just as it is to discuss with our patients. So there's a lot of misinformation about clinical trials. And in my experience, the more data you have, the more informed you can be. And in that situation, the more likely you are to participate. And when you do participate, it will be with a better idea of why you're doing it, what the expectation is likely to be. So today we're going to talk a little bit about what a clinical trial is, what kind of oversight there is for subjects, when and why you should consider participating, what are some of the key things to learn before signing up. Now, I want to point out also that clinical trials, there's misinformation about clinical trials and there's suspicion about clinical trials for good reason. There's been a number of clinical trials in our US history where subjects have been, for example, treated without their consent, as happened in the in a disease in hepatitis in the Willowbrook State School, where they've been treated without real good controls, so that there was no understanding of why they were going through this. And then maybe one of the most notorious is the Tuskegee experiment, where patients were monitored for the effects of a disease, in this case syphilis, long after a treatment for that disease was discovered. So these individuals did not receive the adequate treatment even up to the mid-1970s, all of which puts a high burden on the medical establishment to really change and correct the way that we talk about trials, the way we consent trials, and the way we undertake them. And these things you'll always you'll hear about these from Tuskegee and the Willowbrook State School, the Jewish chronic family, where people were not treated the way that they are now. Luckily, all these incidents led to some very robust and highly publicized and highly conducted fundamentals of how clinical trials have to be done now. We'll talk a little bit about that. So what is a clinical trial, which is also called a clinical study? Well, when there's a question about whether or not there is some new intervention that could help someone, let's say it's a pill to treat high blood pressure or a intravenous medication that might change the fibrosis in the marrow, for example. The initial clinical research is done in what we call preclinical context. And what that means is that work is done in either mice models, which you'll also hear called as murine models, or it can be done in cell lines where human cells are grown in the lab and the drug might be tested in those. Now, those don't involve consent in the same way. Certainly studies on animals are regulated, but in general, preclinical research does not involve humans. It involves sometimes human tissue, but it's not in the human at that time. Clinical trials, which can be anywhere from phase 1 to phase 4, are those that involve humans, where an individual is prescribed a medication or is given a medication as part of this trial. Sometimes it's a medication, sometimes it's an intervention that's not a medicine, like I'm asking you to do yoga 5 days a week, and we're going to measure whether or not your blood pressure goes down. Or we know you're already taking one medicine, we're going to add another one onto it, and we're going to measure what the effects are on your blood chemistries or your magnesium. Now, interesting, there's also trials that occur once a drug is on the market. These are actually called phase 4 trials, and they look at what the safety is of that drug after it's been prescribed and used in a general population. So the real question that a clinical trial asks is, can a certain intervention impact an outcome? And that means you have to know what the intervention is, and you have to know what you're measuring for outcome. For example, in this question, does a new pill prevent spleen growth in patients with myelofibrosis? So the first question might be, is the pill safe for humans? And in that study, that pill might be given to people without myelofibrosis, without an enlarged spleen, and just to make sure that no side effects that are particularly severe are noted. The dosing that might be chosen for that very first study is based on dosing in rats or dogs or sometimes in monkeys to make sure that the dose that's given to the humans is at a dose where there's no predicted side effects. Now, the next question, the next step in that clinical trial might be, is this pill safe for individuals with a specific kind of cancer, and what's the right dose? That is what we would call a phase 1 study, or sometimes a phase 1/2 study. And in that study, the pill would be started at a very low dose. And if there's no side effects in the first 3 individuals, it would go up to a slightly higher dose. And they would check and make sure there's no side effects, and they would go onto a higher dose. And in that situation, the end point of this study, the outcome of this study is safety and toxicity. Is this pill tolerable? And if so, what is the right dose? Now, the next kind of study would be in individuals taking the pill. If they have myelofibrosis, does that myelofibrosis respond? Are there toxicities that are particular to patients with myelofibrosis? So this would be, for example, a phase 2 study. And in phase 2 study, the individuals chosen for the study are the ones where they have the disease that's of interest, and the outcome is whether or not there are any responses noted. Sometimes these studies are randomized. Sometimes these studies, everybody gets the exact same intervention. Sometimes the randomization is, for example, among 2 different doses of the pill, or among the pill alone plus the pill with somebody else or something else. So those randomizations can help give a hint about toxicity, and about response. And the last study, which would be called a phase 3 study, is does the pill work better than the standard of care to prevent spleen growth, to prolong life, to improve symptoms? And depending on what the outcome is, that depends on how many people you need to put in this phase 3 study. And in a phase 3 study, there is a randomization, and that randomization is against the current standard of care. So if the current standard of care for having high blood pressure is a medicine like metoprolol, then the phase 3 might say, does this new pill work better or the same than metoprolol to lower blood pressure? And the clinical trials, for example, that led to the FDA approval of the JAK inhibitor ruxolitinib were against, for example, the standard of care in patients with myelofibrosis. And the outcome was, does the spleen shrink by 35%? And later on, they tried to use that same data to understand whether or not ruxolitinib prolongs life. So what are the phases? Well, we've just talked about phase 1, which is typically in healthy volunteers or sometimes in patients to determine safety and tolerability. Phase 2 is the initial study that looks at whether or not there's any response at all. Is this worth pursuing? And if so, should we do it in a small number of patients first to make sure that it's really worth moving forward with this? Phase 3 studies are much larger. These are what we call pivotal trials, meaning if the drug proves to be better than the standard of care, then the way we treat patients will pivot. Things will change. So when you hear pivotal trials, the outcome of this trial is designed to change the way that patients are treated. And these are in large numbers of patients. They're typically randomized. And sometimes they're randomized against a placebo, which is like a dummy pill, one that has no effect, versus sometimes they're randomized against best available therapy, or sometimes they're randomized against the prior standard of care. In every case, people need to get the minimal approved standard of care. So if the Food and Drug Administration has already decided that the standard of care for high-risk myelofibrosis with spleen enlargement and symptoms is treatment with ruxolitinib, then in a randomized study, the new pill has to be randomized against that study, but that person needs to also be getting that. So you cannot deprive someone of already approved therapy in a randomized study. Now, phase 4 studies are post-approval trials that are sometimes about to study a given condition. Can this approved drug be used in people whose renal function isn't great? And maybe that wasn't a question in the phase 3 study, but the FDA wants to know if that's true. So then the company might do studies of this pill in people whose renal function is very impaired, or somebody who has heart failure, for example. So why should you think about participating? Well, there's different considerations in phase 3, phase 1, and phase 2, and phase 1 and phase 3. So in phase 3 study, you should think about participating and understand that it's possible you won't get the new treatment, that you'll be randomized to the standard of care. But that still means in many phase 3 studies, many people can, if they're in the control arm and the investigation arm is doing very well and the control arm, they're not doing well on the control arm, sometimes they're allowed to cross over and be treated on the control arm. Phase 2 studies means that your information about how your disease responds will be part of how we learn about this new drug. Phase 1 studies are also about teaching and learning about the toxicities. And sometimes there can be a particularly excellent drug that you are able to participate in a phase 1 study, but many times the doses are low. So it's important to talk to your doctor about what phase that study is and what that means for me when I'm on this study. So let's talk a little bit about oversight of clinical trials. So there's oversight occurs at many levels. The first level is the Food and Drug Administration, and they have to make sure that all novel agents, all new drugs go through a review, and they audit these clinical trials to make sure that the clinical trials are being performed in a way that is consistent with the way the protocol was written and consistent with the way that the patients understood being on that protocol. There's also a local institution review, both of the Institutional Review Board and a scientific review committee who review whether or not the trial is appropriately written and is using the data correctly. There's audits both internally and by data safety monitoring committees. And then also all of us who participate in clinical trials have to regularly disclose whether or not we get payments for example, sometimes if I give a talk and that talk is sponsored by a pharmaceutical company, I would need to disclose that I'm not also doing clinical trials for that drug. And so those kind of financial disclosures have to occur. In the industry that is hoping to develop the drug also has data safety monitoring committees, monitors. There's distribution of every toxicity that occurs. And finally, trials are designed to be safe. So if there's any kind of hint that there's a safety problem or a lack of response, certain automatic stopping rules are built into the trial so that the trial won't advance or enroll more people if it's not deemed to be safe. So what are the barriers to participation? So first off, there's appropriate barriers. Some people may not want to participate or may be counseled against participating because that trial is really not the right person for them, or the right trial for them to go through. Maybe they have very well-controlled disease and they're doing very well. Well, I would not put that person in a study of a new drug if their disease is stable at this time, right? They need to be changed to new therapies only when their current therapy isn't working. Sometimes there's barriers to participating because the way the clinical trial is written excludes too many people. Maybe it is so burdensome that you have to be at the trial center every day for a week for 3 months in a row. That's a lot of burden for somebody who lives 200 or 300 miles away from the center where the trial is. Sometimes there's misinformation. Like I said, some people think that they're just being used as a guinea pig, that they don't want to, that they're not adequately, that they're not going to be part of a well-controlled and well-designed system. And that's information that we as physicians have to dispel. And finally, occasionally there is systemic bias, meaning that there's constraints to participation that inequitably are barriers to one person, to one group of people. And in particular, I see this in participating in clinical trials in Wisconsin. If there's a lot of travel back and forth to the site, for example, that can be very hard for somebody who lives in northern Wisconsin and gets care down here for them to come regularly. Or it might be hard for people who are older who don't drive as much and have to rely on their children to take off work to bring them down to the center, for example. So there's a lot of barriers that we're really committed to trying to limit. So the steps of going through a clinical trial are, the first is you go through informed consent. And that means not just looking at a document that tells you about the study, but discussing it with your doctor. Is this the right trial for me and why? And going through exactly what the steps of being in that trial look like. Once you've gone through that, then you go through something called screening. So after you've signed the informed consent, the physician gathers information about you. How big is your spleen? Do you have enlarged lymph nodes? Do you have the chemistries in your blood that would be safe to administer this new medication? And as long as all the screening is written, then and is approved, then you can be enrolled in the study. Now, sometimes that enrollment just means you automatically begin the intervention, but sometimes it means you're randomized. If there's more than one possible intervention, we call those arms, then sometimes there's a computer that assigns you to one of those arms, or a coin flip or something similar, and that tells you which arm of the study that you're going to be on. And then you begin the intervention. And while you're being treated, you're monitored for safety. The medication is reduced if there's some complication. And also there's reporting of any adverse events that occur. After you go through the intervention, then you move to the end of treatment phase. And this end of treatment usually occurs. So as long as you are benefiting, and as long as there's not a reason to have you come off of the study, then you continue on the intervention. And the informed consent phase tell you what are the reasons to come off of study. Once you come off study, sometimes because of toxicity, sometimes because there's safety data that indicates that the treatment isn't safe, or sometimes it might be because the treatment hasn't been adequate in controlling your disease. And end of treatment is the end of your participation in the study, but not necessarily the end of the study. And as long as the study persists, then you have a right to hear about how it's going and what are the overall results. So informed consent is the process by which you learn about the study and then you consent to be part of it. And while it includes a document, which is an important document, it's really more of a conversation. And in that conversation, the physician needs to disclose information. They need to make sure that you have a true comprehension of the process and what it entails. You, as the person being consented, need to have the capacity to do that, meaning you need to be able to, for example, it should be in the language that you speak. And the consenter should be speaking your language or using an interpreter. And you also need to be of sound mind. You can't really give consent if your disease has made you confused or unable to understand the nature of your illness. And it should be voluntary. So one of the things is that we don't give a lot of money to participate in trials, because then people might participate in trials for ulterior motives. So all of these things, the nature of the treatment, alternatives, what the potential benefits might be, having an opportunity to ask questions, all of those things are part of the informed consent. And I want you, when you're thinking about a consent, to make sure that each of these things are reviewed with you. How the trial would be conducted, the risks and benefits, your rights, and that it's voluntary. So these kind of features are part of every informed consent. So I will tell you that is not quite as straightforward as it might seem right now. This is our cartoon that I got from Dr. Jason Gottlieb, and it really goes over the fact that it can get really, really confusing. So one thing to remember is you don't have to rush. You have as much time as you need to examine the informed consent, to review it. And the other thing to remember is that none of these are a contract. Just because you sign it doesn't mean that you can't say, oh, you know what? I've thought about this and it's just not the right thing for me to do. And just because you say no, sometimes you still have an opportunity to go back and say, you know what? I've been thinking about this and I do think I want to think about participating in that trial. So it's not a contract. Your eligibility is judged at one point in time. So if you're not if you are eligible on the 27th of February and then something happens, it's possible on the 1st of March you might not be eligible. But if you are, you and your doctor can talk about it. So what about screening? So screening is the period of time before being consented to the drug and the start of the drug or randomization. And typically that's about a month. And during that time, the eligibility criteria is reviewed by the investigator, and we make a checklist of the disease and the patient characteristics that have to be met for that trial enrollment. And sometimes procedures are done, like a bone marrow biopsy or a CT scan. And sometimes during this period of time, you stop taking other medications because those medications might interfere with the new treatment that you would be given. And these are some examples of eligibility criteria. For example, your disease has to be intermediate or high risk. The spleen needs to be palpated 5 centimeters below the costal margin. Your creatinine can't be elevated. Your liver functions can't be elevated. Your bilirubin can't be elevated, for example. And those are the types of things that we go through during screening. Now, what about the treatment and schedule of procedures? So you can see here, there's a bunch of arrows, and what those arrows might mean in this example is that during the first day and then 4 times additionally in that first month, you have to visit with the investigator and have blood draws. So that's 5 total visits in the first 28 days. And then between cycle 1 and cycle 2, which is 56 days, it looks like you need 2 additional visits. And this appears to continue until cycle 4, when you only have to come at the beginning of each cycle, for example. And then you could look and see, well, on this day, I have to get a bone marrow biopsy and a CT scan, and that also happens on this day. So again, you can sort of go through this map and have an idea of how often you're to show up at the hospital. And that's the kind of calendar that you'll be given if you decide to participate in a clinical trial. And during the clinical trial and a visit, you would have a physical exam and a history. You might have some test results that you go through, and a decision would be made about increasing, decreasing, or staying on the same dose of the study drug. Now, at the end of treatment, that means you've completed your required time on the study, and if you're still continuing clinical benefit. Sometimes you have progressive disease or you're too sick to continue, and the protocol requires that you stop the treatment. Sometimes that the patient exhibits unacceptable toxicity, or the investigator chooses to have them stop the study for one reason or another. And sometimes people need a follow-up visit after that. There's a lot of ways that you can come off of study, and these are important questions to go through. So how can you engage in the process? Well, of course, review the consent form, ask lots of questions. Make sure you're telling, and this accounts for everybody who goes to the doctor, and that's what are your current medications and your allergies. You should be aware of what the study requires and what the doses are and the schedule. And you have to let the trial team know and your doctor know if there's new or concerning symptoms. You need to contact the study team before taking any new medications, for example. It's important to be your own advocate, but it's also important to have a family or friend who comes with you and advocates for you as well. And then finally, a patient is often asked to keep a diary of their symptoms, a diary of how it is to take the medicines. And that's a good way to really make sure that you're providing the right information to the study team so that they can learn the most possible about the disease and about the intervention. So other things to think about is the study drug free? Now, typically, if the study drug is part of the standard of care, then often it's charged to your insurance just as the standard of care would be. But if the study drug is investigational and not typically available for the treatment, then it's usually provided by the study itself. It's almost unheard of that you would be asked to pay for being to get some innovative drug. And if that's the case, I would have a lot of concerns about being in that study. Visits, labs, and procedures are typically paid either by the trial, or if they would occur even if you weren't on study, then they can be paid for by insurance. Occasionally, lodging expenses or travel are reimbursed or defrayed in some way by the study, and that should be something that you ask about. When you talk to your doctor, make sure you ask about things like phrases that you don't understand: open label, single or double blind, placebo controlled, crossover design. All of those could occur in the study. Open label just means that there's no blinding. Everybody knows who's getting what intervention, versus blinding when either you don't know what you're being treated with, or in what's called a double blind, you don't know what you're being treated with and your doctor doesn't know what you're being treated with. And that's often done to keep people from inserting bias in how they feel or what they report. Placebo controlled is what I mentioned, where you get the standard of care plus, for example, a placebo, or the standard of care plus this new medicine. And that's a way to make sure that we're really understanding what the effect of the new medicine is. And then crossover design, I mentioned that also earlier, where somebody on one arm of the study can be moved on to the second arm of the study if the first arm doesn't work for them. So how do you find out about clinical trials? And you can do that through something like this, where there's lots of resources. And I'm going to take it, when I finish this talk, I'm going to show you how to use this one, which is the largest, and it's called clinicaltrials.gov. But there's also lots of other places that curate what clinical trials are available. Some of them are here, but I would also argue that the MPN Advocacy International has lots of information about clinical trials that are available. So I'll end now. I just want to say thanks. Jason Gottlieb, who's an expert in MPNs at Stanford, shared some of these slides with me, and really has been a great friend and colleague in my MPN journey. And Anne Brazeau, who just does a lot. And of course, you all, as I mentioned at the beginning, nothing would be possible without the work of patients, and patient advocacy is especially important in the MPN field. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing for now. Let's see if I can do this here. Hold on.
Thank you, Laura.
And I'm just gonna move over. Hold on. Am I stopped sharing? Hold on.
No, you can share. You were going to share something else.
Yeah, I just want to share just so I can show people how to do something here.
Yeah.
All right, so can you guys see Google?
Yes.
Okay, so just in your Google or whatever your search engine is, do clinicaltrials.gov.
Mm-hmm.
And this will take you to the website of clinicaltrials.gov home. And then what you can do here is search among more than 400,000 studies. And the way I typically did is, let's say we want to study in polycythemia vera. Type that into disease and then just hit search. And what you'll see here is that there's 303 studies. Well, that's a lot to go through, but maybe you want to know just which ones are open for enrollment at this point. So you would click on recruiting, for example. And then you want to know just those in adults. And then let's say you just want to know, this is one that is just going to test a new agent, like we just finished talking about. You would click interventional. And then maybe you're just interested in phase 2 studies, not phase 1 or phase 3, for example. And then you could click apply. And now you're down to 22 studies. So now you've really limited it to what you want to look for. And then one thing you can also go down is look under study. You can look on map. So you go up here and you can click on map, and here are the clinical trials. Well, 19 of those are here. And now you can say, oh, these are the ones in Illinois, or these are the ones in, and so here are some studies that are available in Illinois that fit all the criteria that I clicked on below. So these are the, and then if you want to say, well, I also want to know about phase 1 studies, you can click on that, and that will broaden you up, and now you've got 40 studies to look at. So sometimes that can be helpful. Take a few screenshots before you go to your doctor and say, I'm interested in this and this, and that can sometimes be a way to start understanding where those clinical trials are for you. Okay.
Excellent. I'm so glad you did that, because so often people will call us and say, well, I went to clin.gov and I can't navigate it. And that was you put it very simply and very well. Thank you for that. And thank you for your presentation. It's great. Every single time I watch you do this, I learn something else. I want to talk about 2 things. Number 1, today is Rare Disease Day, National Rare Disease Day. Thus, I'm heading to Washington, D.C. this week to go on the Hill and meet with legislators on Friday. It's Open Legislative Day to talk about some of the issues MPN patients have, and in terms of access and pricing and other issues. But also in 2000, so 23 years ago this month, it was a leap year, in February 29th, clin.gov was created by the NIH and the FDA, and it was basically born out of wanting to be a watchdog, wanting to know what was going on where. And 23 years later, it's just been a really great resource for physicians and patients alike, and scientists. So we'll get to our questions. And the first one is, how does one request having the drug instead of placebo? How does that work? You
so
kind of explained it. You can't request.
Yeah, you can't request.
I always say, I think I'd be upset if I, finally get to a clinical trial and then discover I'm on placebo.
Well, so first off, you shouldn't be upset. Now, shouldn't is a hard word, but the reason you shouldn't be upset is because clinical trials are done when we do not know whether or not the medication is better than the standard of care. And I want to just say again, placebo is only used in addition to the standard of care. So for example, if they were testing a new drug in polycythemia vera, for example, and that new drug was to be used in people with low risk disease, those people with low risk disease would still get, for example, phlebotomies. They would still have aspirin, because we know those are the standard of care in polycythemia vera. So the drug would be given in addition to the standard of care, and maybe then they would be randomized to the new drug versus placebo. So 1, we only do trials when we do not know if the placebo is better, and medical history is full of examples. A lot more drugs have been tested that turn out to be worse than the standard of care than better. So, and that's true in myelofibrosis also. So you shouldn't be too eager necessarily to get the interventional medicine, because it's rare that there's a home run. And it's rare that that new intervention is really going to prove to be some exceedingly different. So if there was a true difference that was known between the experimental drug and the standard of care, we would not do the study, because our obligation is always to give you what's absolutely considered the optimal treatment.
Okay, excellent answer. 2 more questions here and others, but 2 that I'll get to right away. One is, with all the combination drugs being looked at now for MPN patients, and there are some trials with drugs that have been commercialized or approved by the FDA, Are you seeing, from your perspective, some great results with combination therapies in MPNs?
I do think that combination therapies are the way we're going to go. I think that's because the JAK inhibitors, while excellent therapy for MPNs in some ways, are not enough. They're not sufficient to really reverse all of the impacts of an MPN, and they're not sufficient typically on their own to change the nature of the disease. We're learning more about whether or not they lower the allelic burden, for example, the amount of molecular mutations that people have. But in general, these treatments are not adequate as monotherapy to really overhaul the fundamental problem in the bone marrow. And we have yet to prove that any interventions can prevent some of the most dreaded consequences, like progression to more aggressive disease, for example. And so I think that's part of why we move to combinations. And the other part is that even if we're able to really improve the spleen or really improve symptoms, some people also are developing other problems like anemia, for example, or like fibrosis. And so maybe we need not just a belt, but also suspenders, right? To make sure that we're really tackling all of the myriad impacts that these diseases have on an individual.
Yes, great answer. So when it comes to children, and now we know there are many young people with MPNs, we also know that clinical trials in children are very rare. I know that Dr. Cuisine and Dr. Razar are going to be starting a trial, I think, in the next year. But, how do you know about dosing with children with an MPN?
So we don't know with dosing in children. This is why in an individual under the age of 18, I highly, highly, highly encourage them to have at least one appointment with a pediatric hematologist with some specialty in MPNs, because children are unique. It's much more difficult to do clinical trials in children. And those clinical trials are harder to conduct because the disease is so much more rare. So if I need 100 adults to prove that spleen shrinks when you use a given JAK inhibitor, right? And I see 50,000 people to get those 100, right? Think about it, if your disease is that much rarer as it is in children, I might need to see 100,000 people or 120,000 people in order to get those 100 people to prove that. And that is an exercise in futility for trying to develop those trials. So that's why the work that has been doing by pediatricians who specialize in this, who are collecting data on, okay, in our clinic, I'm seeing so many of these patients, we're going to try X, Y, and Z on a trial situation. So I really do encourage that. It's not in everybody's, it's not feasible for everybody to travel, but there are pediatric hematologists in academic centers near you or somewhat close to people, and they can sometimes even just virtually make some connections with those who do specialize in it.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I know those two are doing telemed quite often with people across the country, because one's in New York and one's in DC or that area. So you also mentioned a couple times here about the barriers to clinical trials. And that's something that we feel very strongly about, because if you've seen me speak before, you know that I bring up the weird chart, or the weird slide, which is typically in clinical trials, they're white, educated, insured, retired, the demographic is fairly similar across the board. And, but I look at the barriers, we look at the barriers to being in a trial. And if I'm 35 years old with 2 kids at home and I have a full-time job and a family, and other responsibilities, but I'd love to be in a trial. Are there any trials that you're aware of that, I mean, we know some places and resources for those of you watching today where you can get some help in, travel expenses and accommodations and those kinds of things. But are you aware of any new things that are out there for the younger person or the person from, different cultures that would like to participate in a trial?
So I can't speak generally, but I can speak when you meet with your doctor, when you're talking about clinical trial participation. It makes sense to think extremely concretely. I can't come on Wednesdays, even though the trial says I have to. And that's because my daughter works that day and I have to take care of her child. So how can we accommodate that? How can I still be in the trial and have that accommodated? Or I winter in Florida. And so if I'm in this clinical trial, would you be able to send the medicine down to Florida if I could get labs down there? Now, one of the things that happened with the pandemic is that the Food and Drug Administration required a lot of new trials to be easier to access. They required that you're allowed to use verbal telephone consenting in some cases. They allowed your home lab. So if you have a lab that's near your home in northern Wisconsin, you don't necessarily need to come down to southern Wisconsin to have your blood drawn, for example. So they did make some allowances in clinical trial operations to make it somewhat more accessible. But really on a study-by-study basis, some studies offer travel vouchers, some studies offer some kind of buffer for the obstacles to get into a clinical trial. But they can't do that much because that would be considered coercion.
Yeah.
So that's why organizations like yours and others provide certain reimbursements for people to be on trial. Those of us who know what rare diseases are like all of you, recognize how important clinical trials are and how we need to really do as much as we can to get people involved. And so there are, whether or not it's this organization, National Organization for Rare Diseases, the LLS, there's a lot of resources out there for clinical trial participation.
Yeah. So are there any trials currently, this is from an ET patient who is not on therapy to determine progression? I know yes. We talk about progression often. Yeah.
Right, exactly. So right now, there is no clinical trials that I am aware of where the outcome is progression to myelofibrosis or acute leukemia. And that's because those are very rare in essential thrombocythemia. So if I needed to get enough patients to prove that that didn't happen, I would need a huge number of patients. There are some clinical trials in ET that will, just like in polycythemia vera, look at the amount of genetic disease over time after institution of a given intervention. That is called the molecular response. But we do not yet have firm data that molecular response prevents progression of the disease. So that's still early. But I think science is moving very much towards understanding whether or not the molecular makeup of the disease changes the overall disease behavior.
This question is very good. I'm glad this person asked because I know patients that were on or in trials with a particular drug that was doing remarkably well for them. And then the trial was stopped and the drug was shelved and it's nowhere now. I mean, it's gone. And so if this person participates in a trial that's managed and it does help their disease, can they continue on that drug if the trial is shut down or is over? once the trial is over and the drug has not been commercialized?
Yeah, so not typically. So if there's 100 people on the trial and 80 are doing well, but 20 develop some very strange or catastrophic occurrence, sometimes the company will say, well, 20 out of 100 is too many. We're not going to pursue this any longer. And that takes it away even from the 80 who were doing well on the medication. Sometimes there'll be 100 people on the trial and 50 are doing pretty well, but of the 50 have some side effects, means they stop it. And of those 50, only 10 have some kind of response to their disease. Even if you're in that 10, if the trial stops, you can't continue. Sometimes the trial is going and they say, hey, we've got 100 people on this trial, 75 have done great. So we're going to try and get this drug approved by the Food and Drug Administration. But the trial stops, and now there's still 6 months, 12 months, a year before the Food and Drug Administration is going to review that. There is sometimes the ability, and this is written into the consent, for compassionate use. And that means people that were on the study doing well can continue on until the Food and Drug Administration reviews the application. But the truth is that when you're in the study, there is no guarantee that you can continue on the drug. And there's also no guarantee that after you come off study, even if the Food and Drug Administration now approves it, well, now you have to pay for it, right? Or somebody has to pay for it. So I wouldn't say that it's always fair. It's not, fairness is not one of the key values. It's safety, and safety has to be amortized over everybody in the study, not just an individual.
Yeah. And also in the case of that particular drug, the company just didn't have the money to continue, which brings up another whole issue about, you know, who has the funds to continue and who doesn't. All right. So how long does it take to bring a new drug to market? A successful drug, you know, one that's
long time. I mean, what we know is that in 2005, the JAK2 V617F was discovered, and in 2010, I think, or 2011, they had the first medication. But it takes a long time. It takes longer when there's more treatments out there, because there's fewer patients to be put on the study. It's always fastest, or it's often fastest when you've got the first new medication or the first new approach. But it takes years. And even after a drug does do all the studies that they need to, it takes a while for it to be reviewed and approved as well. So it's a long process.
It can be. I mean, Jakafi was the first, as Dr. Michael said, and that actually some people thought was pretty fast. I remember, you know, some talking about how, oh, good, you know, it's here. Okay, so has Jakafi been used long enough to determine any success in remission of PV?
I am going to say remission. It definitely has disease control. I do not know the latest data on whether or not there's any increased likelihood of allelic burden decrease with ruxolitinib. I should know that, but I do not have that on the tip of my fingers right now.
Yeah, and I think Dr. Kamaraju, who was with us last week, said it's not necessarily remission. If anything, it might be a little decrease in allelic burden, but I'm just telling you that secondhand now from what he said. If I have an autoimmune disease, am I still allowed to participate in a clinical trial? Good question, because
that's a fabulous question, and that really requires reviewing the eligibility criteria, because some eligibility criteria says you can have another problem as long as it doesn't affect your kidney or your lungs in this particular way. Sometimes people have more than one cancer, like maybe somebody has some skin cancer, or maybe somebody has been treated for breast cancer in the past. Sometimes that can be a conflict for getting on the study as well. If you're on a different chemotherapy, it's unlikely that they'll be able to let you on a new chemotherapy, for example. But, you know, that's all part of the conversation and part of that consent conversation.
Mm-hmm. And what about stem cell transplants?
So stem cell
are there trials? Are there, I mean, how does that work?
Yeah, so there are definitely clinical trials in stem cell transplants, but never a clinical trial that not never, but not currently a clinical trial that randomized you to getting a transplant versus not getting a transplant, because those are too difficult to conduct. We are doing through the Center for Medical Science a study that looks at people with myelofibrosis who are treated with a JAK inhibitor versus those that are taken to transplant. And we're following those outcomes. That's a very long-term observational study. When you go to a transplant doctor, though, they may say, well, we're going to try this medicine to make sure you don't have graft versus host disease, or we're going to use this particular kind of JAK inhibitor before you get transplanted, and that's part of a trial. So there's absolutely clinical trials that happen in the context of transplant.
Right. And this question, I think, we just need to clarify. The question is, should I ask my hematologist about getting into a trial, or should I just get into a trial and then talk to my hematologist? And I'm not
a little bit of both. I mean,
who wrote this, but you do have to talk to your hematologist.
Yeah, your doctor should know. Most trials are being run through the center where you're going to be seen. And so if you're at a hematologist where a clinical trial is not open and you're interested in it, you can ask them and say, look, I saw this clinical trial. It's open at Cleveland Clinic or Northwestern or MCW or Stanford. Can I get involved with that trial? And maybe your doctor says, hey, it turns out it's open here too. I'd love to enroll you. Or they say, I think that's a great idea. You should go up there. Or they can look on clinicaltrials.gov also. They can see the eligibility and they can say, oh, I'd love to get you into it, but it's only taking people over the age of 60. You're 59. Let's think about doing it next year, for example.
Yeah, for example, great. Are clinical trials used to determine treatment guidelines? It seems like there is some confusion as to who should be treated versus watch and wait.
Yeah, there are. Clinical trials are sometimes used to guide treatment guidelines. Sometimes those guidelines arise when there is no solid answer. So we still live in kind of a no data zone a lot of the time. And so that's when they get experts around to talk. And you're right, there are definitely, absolutely instances where people can look at the same information and come to two different conclusions, right? And that leads to sometimes confusion, but the truth is medicine is not an algorithm. And a lot of times you have to make decisions with the person sitting in front of you after reviewing the evidence that is there. And I do think that one of the main concerns, or one of the main significant questions that's out there, for example, is right now, should people with low risk PV be treated with interferons? There's still, I think, a very active question out there about whether or not people that have lower risk myelofibrosis need treatment and what that does for them. Those are questions that you have to examine pretty carefully when you're sitting with your patient in the clinic.
So true. So true. I've known patients who, had MF who were not treated with anything. And, 10 years later, definitely needed something. So that it begged the question, should they have started something sooner? You just don't know. Okay, we have another question coming up here. And
I'm just going to interrupt for 1 second.
I know you have to leave.
I have a hard stop in a few minutes. So
okay.
When we'll do 2 more questions.
So I'll give you 2 more questions and then we'll wrap up. Are there clinical trials in CRISPR studies?
CRISPR is currently being used for gene therapy trials. And that gene therapy is where in some diseases, you can use CRISPR to remove the genes of a given of a given cell, and then that cell can then be reproduced and go back in your body. That is not currently being used in human trials in most diseases. I think there's a few gene therapy trials where that's being used. However, CRISPR is a technology that's being used in the preclinical studies to understand about how diseases work and how medications might enter the cell more effectively, et cetera.
Okay, great. Is it a good idea to participate in a trial if you are asymptomatic but considered intermediate 1 risk?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And that depends on the trial. And it depends on weighing the risk versus the benefit. And that's really what the consent conference should be about. I wouldn't, if I was in your situation and you were asymptomatic with low risk disease, I would be hesitant to taking a new medicine that might be that might have toxicities or might cause me to have problems, that has the risk of problems, for example, of the heart or the kidneys. But if I was looking at an intervention that was low risk, let's say an intervention to use a certain vitamin supplement, or an intervention that said, we're going to look at people and we're going to see if walking 5 times a week changes their fatigue level. That kind of clinical trial has a low risk to it, and therefore might be more appropriate for somebody whose disease is not causing them risk.
Okay. So in wrapping up, and of course, I thank you with all my heart, and I hope to see you soon. And but in closing, what kind of hope can you impart to the patients out there when it comes to these trials? And we're going to hear from our industry partners, which is a nice segue into what they're doing and what's happening in the in clinical trials with industry.
Well, I mean, I really find this to be an incredibly inspiring field to be working in. I graduated from my fellowship from my residency in 2006. In that time, really the entire field has been transformed. People are living longer and people are living better. And that speed, that transformation is accelerating. And I really, so I think this is a very encouraging time. Even if we haven't yet been able to eradicate the disease, we're making significant inroads, and that will continue. So I'm very encouraged.
You and me both. It's been 20 years for me, which is unbelievable. But you know, I met you shortly after I got into this space. So it's just been amazing. And thank you, thank you, thank you. These conversations with MPN specialists have been great. For those of you with us, Laura is in Wisconsin at the Freudite. I always say this wrong, but tell everyone where you are in case
so I'm at the Medical College of Wisconsin, which is associated with Froedtert Hospital. Yes. We're in Milwaukee, and we have a great group of MPN specialists here. So please reach out if you need anything.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Fantastic. And don't leave us, or Laura's going to leave us, but we're going to hear from our industry partners. Bye, Laura. Thanks again. So we're going to hear from our industry partners. So don't go away, because they will share some of their insights. In fact, we have Incyte, the other spelling. Kristen Griffiths is with us. She's the Associate Director of Public Affairs at Incyte. Hi, Kristen.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. It is a pleasure and an honor to be here on Rare Disease Day. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. So it's set up here. It's such a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for having me and giving me a few minutes to speak on behalf of my company, or our company, Incyte. So just a little bit of background on Incyte. We are a biopharmaceutical company based in Wilmington, Delaware, and we're really committed to making a difference in the lives of patients through scientific discovery. Rigorous science is at the core of everything we do to discover, develop, and deliver novel medicines to meet serious medical diseases in the oncology space, as well as other disease areas. One of the most important commitments for Incyte is really to help ensure that patients have appropriate access to the medicines that they need. And for this reason, we've developed a patient support program called Incyte Cares to help appropriate patients and healthcare providers access their prescribed medication. So for eligible patients, Incyte Cares offers prescription insurance verification, and prior authorization support, free drug and copay assistance for those who qualify under the program's terms and conditions, as well as an ongoing education and support from a representative. So if any patients who have concerns about accessing prescribed medicines, please contact Incyte Cares for assistance. Information on Incyte Cares can be found at incytecares.com. Once again, that's INCYTE cares.com. And I really highly suggest everybody who's eligible to enroll, because even if you don't think you need assistance initially, circumstances change, it could help you get enrolled and make it a little easier to access medications more quickly. I know we're talking about clinical trials today. I know that we are enrolling in clinical trials. If you're interested, we do ask you to contact your healthcare provider to talk to them a little bit more about what clinical trials might be out there and available for you through Incyte. To look at that information a little bit more closely, you can look at incyteclinicaltrials.com, INCYTE clinicaltrials.com. And just a note about our patient community and the support that we like to give out to our patients. We really strive to support the community and integrate an authentic patient voice in all of our initiatives that we do through our company. To that end, partnerships like the one that we have with Anne's group, the MPN Advocacy and Education International, they've really been key in helping us understand the unmet patient need as well as caregiver needs, which we realize are also so important, including raising disease awareness and providing educational information to the community. For that reason, we have a website called voicesofmpn.com, where we provide access to MPN information, patient meetings, stories, podcasts, and there's also a symptom tracker. And we also have a newly launched healthcare provider search tool as well. So I do encourage you to go there and check that out. And while you're there, you can nominate your MPN hero. MPN hero nominations are now open through our website, and we highly suggest that you go ahead and nominate. Now that that's open today on Rare Disease Day, we're really excited about that window opening. So now in closing, I just want to say thank you so much, Anne and your team. You just do incredible work. It's an honor to be here, and it's an honor to be able to share in programs like this, which allows Incyte to use our funds to help improve the lives of patients and individuals who are impacted most by the diseases in that which we work. So thank you. Turning it back to you.
Thanks, Kristen. And I have to say, Incyte Cares, for those of you on Jacify who are, if you have any issue, call there, because they're fantastic. The criteria is amazing to be able to get assistance. Okay, thank you, Kristen. And we'll move on to AbbVie and Virginia Tejero, who is the Associate Science Director. Hi, how are you?
Hi, Anne. Good. Yeah. How are you? Thank you so much for having us. And thanks to MPN Advocacy and Education International for allowing me to discuss AbbVie's clinical myelofibrosis program today. So as Anne said, my name is Virginia Tejero. I'm an Associate Scientific Director in U.S. Medical Affairs at AbbVie. So as you know, AbbVie is a global pharmaceutical company and a leader in the transformation of care for patients with blood cancers. We are striving to advance standards of care and bring transformative treatment options to patients, including those with myelofibrosis. So we are currently evaluating navitoclax in myelofibrosis. Please note, navitoclax is an investigational agent and not currently FDA approved. So safety and efficacy are still under evaluation. So navitoclax is a first-in-class oral small molecule that binds to two proteins called BCL-XL and BCL2, which are pro-survival proteins that prevent cells from dying. So cancer cells can hijack the machinery that makes these survival proteins to keep themselves alive. And navitoclax binds to BCL-XL which can cause myelofibrosis cells to die. Now, JAK inhibitors shut off the pathway that increases production of BCL-XL, making myelofibrosis cells susceptible to BCL-XL inhibition. Now, given the results seen in the phase 2 REFINE study, AbbVie has proceeded with 2 phase 3 studies in fall 2020, both evaluating the combination of navitoclax and ruxolitinib in myelofibrosis in a larger patient set. The first study, TRANSFORM-1, includes patients with myelofibrosis who have not received prior treatment with a JAK inhibitor and is evaluating the safety and efficacy of navitoclax combined with ruxolitinib versus placebo and ruxolitinib. The second phase 3 study, TRANSFORM-2, is currently seeking more patients to participate. This study includes patients with myelofibrosis who have worsening disease as evidenced by an enlarged spleen and symptoms despite previous or current treatment with a JAK2 inhibitor. TRANSFORM-2 is an open-label study, meaning patients and investigators will know what agent they are receiving and will evaluate combination of navitoclax and ruxolitinib versus the best available therapy, which is at the discretion of the physician and could include ruxolitinib, fedratinib, among other options. So we currently have more than 30 sites across the US for each study, and TRANSFORM-2 is still seeking patients to participate. You can find more information regarding the ongoing studies at www.myelofibrosisresearch.com. The site includes further information about each study, a questionnaire to determine if you might be eligible to participate, and a map of current site locations. So thank you very much for your time, everyone.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it, Virginia. And it's a great, as I said, it's a great segue from Dr. Michaelis to hearing about where these trials are, what's going on. You can, find out more at these websites. Thanks, Virginia. So
Thank
now
you.
We'll move on to PharmaEssentia and Denise McNeil, who is the medical science liaison. Hello, how are you, Denise?
Hey, Anne, I'm doing great. How are you today?
Good, thank you.
Thank you, Anne, for having me today. On behalf of PharmaEssentia, I'm very happy to be here. I always love listening to the webinars. They have such wonderful information. You and your team do a very good job of bringing that information to patients, families, caregivers. It's very important to be able to educate on a wide variety of topics. So today I do want to provide just a small update on the work and the research that PharmaEssentia as a company is dedicated to for the treatment of MPNs. I do want to specifically highlight the research that we're doing with ropeg interferon for patients with PV and ET specifically. So for PV, it's our ECLIPSE PV study. That one will begin enrolling patients this year. That one is going to have sites in the US and Canada currently. And a little bit about kind of the hypothesis of this study in PV is that if we look at dosing ropeg interferon a little bit more aggressively, especially up front in the titration phase, that's where we're starting to think that patients can have a more deep, more durable response. Patients can even have a more rapid response when we look at achieving a complete hematologic response, decreasing their allele burden that Dr. Michaelis had mentioned. So it's really exciting to be able to use this data, use this research to be able to truly see if we can impact the overall disease course of PV, ultimately impacting the progression of PV. So that's very exciting for us to participate in that study. For ET, our SURPASS ET and EXCEED ET studies, they're both open to enrolling patients. SURPASS is our global study, and that one is looking at the use of ropeg interferon in comparison to anagrelide in ET patients that are either resistant or intolerant to hydroxyurea. And then EXCEED ET is our single-arm ET study with sites currently in the US and Canada, and that one will assess the efficacy, safety, and tolerability of ropeg in ET patients. I do want to take a moment to thank all the patients and families who do ultimately decide to participate in our studies. again, like having this information from Anne, talking to your hematologist, talking to your families, and to see if this is really a good option for you. And you're always talking about hope. And so we really are truly honored to share in this journey of hope with you all, because our goal at PharmaEssentia is to strive to advance the science of MPNs and to truly create a positive impact in patients living with MPN. So thank you again, Anne. Thank you, Mallory, your whole team for all the work.
And thank you, Denise. And of course, Besremi is on the market, Ropeg interferon. And so I'm glad these studies are being done in ET and PV. That's great. Great news. Thanks, Denise.
Thank you.
So now we'll move on to Imago Sciences, which is now a subsidiary of Merck and Company, and Alicia Shilton-Lloyd, who is the VP of Medical Affairs. Hi, Alicia.
Hey, Anne, thanks so much for having me today. It was so great to hear Laura Michaelis too. She is just phenomenal, and what a power. She actually won an award at ASH today or this year in their 2022 conference for all of the work that she does. And it was just fabulous to see her get the recognition she deserves and then spend the time with us today. What a privilege. I am at Imago. Imago is a clinical stage biopharmaceutical company developing new medicines for the treatment of myeloproliferative neoplasms and other bone marrow diseases. Our lead candidate is bomedemstat. And in fact, when Dr. Michaelis showed us how to use clinicaltrials.com today, you may have noticed that our bomedemstat trial in PV came up. Bomedemstat is an investigational, once-a-day, oral, lysine-specific demethylase 1 or LSD1 inhibitor. And it is believed to play an important role in the maturation of blood cells in the bone marrow. Bomedemstat is an investigational agent, which means it's not yet approved by the FDA for use outside of these clinical trials. But over 200 patients have been treated with bomedemstat in multiple phase 2 clinical trials for the treatment of ET, MF, and PV, in addition to other indications. We presented our latest data on these trials at ASH in December. And as always, we shared the data we presented with you guys and the MPN Advocacy and Education International team. And we included plain language versions of this data. You guys are always just one of the best resources to find out the most current information on any treatment agents and regimens. As shown in the data we presented, the clinical activity thus far warranted continued investigation into a phase 3 study, and we're going to shortly be initiating our phase 3 trials in ET in over 20 countries, including here in the US. As I mentioned earlier, we recently initiated a phase 2 trial in PV in the US, UK, and Australia. We have 10 sites currently active in the US. And then we at Imago and the doctors and the patient participants that we've partnered with in our clinical trials weren't the only ones excited about the data that we've seen so far. And on January 11th, as you alluded to, Anne, Imago was acquired by Merck. And you might guess that from the background I'm using today, which has both the Merck and Imago logos on it, so that you can continue to find us and find bomedemstat and our clinical trials. I'm so excited that bomedemstat is now part of the Merck pipeline. We're working together to integrate Imago into Merck, and throughout this entire process, we will, as always, be partnering with Anne and the MPN Advocacy and Education International team to ensure that our data and information remains as accessible as always, including information on the clinical trials that I just mentioned. So again, Anne, you guys tend to be the first stop shop for us, for those that I'm introducing to the MPN space from Merck, and certainly for patients. I can't thank you enough for all that you've done, including the session that you put together today. Thank you so much, Anne.
Thank you so much, Alicia, and all the folks at Imago and Merck. We really appreciate it and appreciate your support. And we're very happy these trials are going on and going forward. So now we'll move on to GSK and Lori Wilcoxon, who is the patient engagement liaison. Lori, are you there?
I am, and thank you so much. And I just want to echo everything everyone has said, going forward as far as just everything you've done for this patient population and putting on these webinars for them and to just increase their knowledge is truly a gift. So, and does provide a lot of hope. So keep it going, keep it going. So I am Lori Wilcoxon. I want to say good afternoon to everyone and thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak with you today. I am a patient engagement liaison with GSK Oncology. GSK is a global biopharma company with a purpose to unite science, technology, and talent to get ahead of disease together. GSK is focused on maximizing patient survival through transformational medicines, and our focus includes immuno-oncology, cell therapy, tumor cell targeting therapies, and synthetic lethality. Our goal is to achieve a sustainable flow of new treatments based on a diversified portfolio of investigational medicines utilizing modalities such as small molecules, antibody drug conjugates, and cell therapy, either alone or in combination. In July of 2022, GSK completed the acquisition of Sierra Oncology, which is a California-based biopharmaceutical company focused on targeted therapies for the treatment of rare forms of cancer. The acquisition of Sierra Oncology includes momelotinib, which is a late stage potential new medicine with a unique dual mechanism of action that addresses the critical unmet medical needs of myelofibrosis patients with anemia. And the following August, so this past August, GSK announced that the FDA accepted the new drug application for momelotinib. And if approved, momelotinib will continue to grow GSK's specialty medicines business with a US launch anticipated in June of 2023. So that is right around the corner. The new drug application is based on the results from key phase 3 trials. So again, these clinical trials bringing medications to our patient population, including the pivotal MOMENTUM trial. The primary analysis data from the MOMENTUM trial were recently presented at the 2022 American Society of Clinical Oncology annual meeting and the European Hematology Association 2022 Hybrid Congress. Thank you. In closing, I would just like to add that we are so grateful to Anne and her entire team and the entire myelofibrosis advocacy community for all the work you're doing to raise awareness, educate patients and their care partners about this disease. We appreciate the partnership and we have with you and the MPN Advocacy and Education International, and want to thank you again for this opportunity to tell you and your listeners about what we are doing at GSK Oncology.
Thank you so much. And Lori, we'll see you soon, and we'll be hosting another conversation with a specialist very soon. So we'll be in touch.
Right.
Thank you. So CTI Biopharma and Deb Hoyer, who's the medical science liaison. Deb, would you like to share with us what's going on with CTI?
Good afternoon, and the entire Advocacy and Education International team. As Anne said, my name is Deb Hoyer, and I'm a principal medical science liaison at CTI. And again, thank you for hosting this event and allowing us to tell you a little bit what's going on with CTI today. We at CTI recognize that it takes patients, clinicians, and industry to work together to improve therapies and patients' lives, especially in the areas of unmet medical needs, like, for example, in myelofibrosis. Patients who have myelofibrosis and cytopenias, low platelet counts, and red blood cells have limited treatment options until last year when pacritinib, a JAK1 sparing, JAK2 IRAK1 inhibitor, received accelerated approval by the Food and Drug Administration. In fact, that was 1 year ago today. Pacritinib is marketed as Vonjo, an oral drug taken twice daily, and is approved for adult patients with myelofibrosis with a very low platelet counts, meaning less than 50,000, because we recognize that these patients often have more advanced disease, and many can only tolerate a fraction of a dose of currently available therapies. The approval of pacritinib was based on efficacy results from the pivotal phase 3 PERSIST-2 study, the only study that included patients with platelet counts less than 100,000 and no lower limit. PERSIST-2 compared pacritinib at 2 doses to best available therapy that included ruxolitinib. As part of the accelerated approval, CTI is required to describe a clinical benefit in a confirmatory phase 3 trial called Pacifica that is enrolling in the rest of the world, excluding the United States. In April 2022, the National Comprehensive Cancer Network guidelines included pacritinib, not only for patients with myelofibrosis who have less than 50,000 platelet counts, but also as a second-line therapy with no upper limit after prior JAK2 inhibitor use when a bone marrow transplant is not an option. Pacritinib is also an option for lower-risk myelofibrosis patients who have lost or not achieved symptom burden response. Our pursuit for advancing novel therapies and treatments for blood cancer begins with pacritinib. At CTI, we continue to explore pacritinib's unique mechanism of action and impact on cytopenias. In December of 2022, at the American Society of Hematology, the ASH meeting, emerging retrospective data from the PERSIST-2 study was presented by Dr. Stephen O. The data assessed pacritinib's impact on transfusion independence and ACVR1, which is a receptor kinase that controls the expression of the peptide hormone hepcidin. Hepcidin reduction helps lessen the anemia of inflammation that can occur in myelofibrosis. Data showed that pacritinib is a potent inhibitor of ACVR1, in addition to having JAK2 and IRAK1 inhibition. This unique kinase inhibition profile for pacritinib potentially offers a dual mechanism for the improvement of anemia. Additionally, this ASH data showed that a significantly greater portion of patients on pacritinib 200 milligrams BID compared to best available therapy achieved a red blood cell transfusion independence over any 12-week interval through 24 weeks. Also, the percentage of patients who achieved a greater or equal to 50% reduction in transfusion rate over 12-week interval was significantly higher on pacritinib compared to BAT arm, the best available therapy arm. These preclinical and clinical data suggest an important role for pacritinib in addressing anemia in patients with cytopenic myelofibrosis. CTI is committed to ensure that eligible patients can access pacritinib through a comprehensive patient support program called CTI Access. The website address is ctiaccess.com, CTI Access, or the program phone number is 888-CTI-4U. Our team is enthusiastic for our partnership with MPN Advocacy and Education International, and we continue to support rigorous science and data that will bring much needed treatment options to patients living with myelofibrosis, with the goal of improving symptoms, spleen response, and providing hematological improvement or stability. And with that, I have to thank you and the entire MPN Advocacy Education International group, patients, families, caregivers, and my pharmaceutical colleagues for this opportunity to share with you this information today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we will move on to, let's see, where am I going here? MorphoSys and Elsa Levita. Elsa, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me here today, and happy Rare Disease Day to everyone. So it's truly a pleasure to be here today, and thank you to the MPN Advocacy and Education International for your partnership and the opportunity to listen and learn here today. MorphoSys began as a research and development technology provider over 30 years ago in Germany, and today we've evolved into a fully integrated commercial stage biopharmaceutical company that's based in Munich, Germany, and Boston, Massachusetts, and we're focused on the development and delivery of innovative cancer medicines. The burden of cancer is vast on patients, their loved ones, and the healthcare providers, but so are our aspirations for how we redefine how the disease is treated. MorphoSys' pipeline consists of investigational cancer medicines in mid and late stage development, and this includes pelabresib, our investigational BET inhibitor, currently being explored as a first-line treatment option or first phase of treatment for people living with myelofibrosis in phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials called Manifest and Manifest-2. Please visit clinicaltrials.gov for more information about the Manifest-2 clinical trial. Pelabresib is an orally administered small molecule, or in plain terms, it's a pill designed to inhibit the activity of a family of proteins called BET proteins, which contribute to abnormal gene expression in myelofibrosis. Inhibiting or hindering the activity of these BET proteins represents a potential therapeutic approach to myelofibrosis. As we present new data at upcoming medical congresses on Manifest-2, we will work closely with Anne and Mallory to ensure regular and timely updates on our studies are shared with everyone. As a reminder, pelabresib is an investigational new drug, and it's not approved by any regulatory authority, and there is no guarantee that it will be approved. We are committed to people living with myelofibrosis who need new options in the first-line treatment setting and beyond. For anyone who's interested in learning more about our pelabresib clinical trials in myelofibrosis, I would encourage you to visit manifestclinicaltrial.com for more information, and we encourage you to reach out to your healthcare provider with specific questions or concerns. At MorphoSys, we are honored to work closely with patient advocacy organizations serving the blood cancer community, including MPN Advocacy and Education International. We strive to aid the community by creating and supporting programs that provide education, services, and tools to people diagnosed with myelofibrosis and other types of blood cancers and their families. We engage with the community through forums such as this one here today to understand the patient perspective and journey so that we may incorporate these critical insights into our research and development efforts. Thank you again for all of your partnership.
Thank you very much, Elsa. We appreciate it. It's been a great partnership. So we will move on to protagonist and Lindsay Kwon, who is the medical science liaison there. Hi, Lindsay.
Yes, hi, Anne. Well, thank you for having me here and allowing me to give everyone here an update on what's going on at Protagonist Therapeutics. So Protagonist is a biopharmaceutical company located in the South San Francisco Bay Area. We have approximately 100 employees, so we're pretty small still. Our drug platform is based on proprietary peptide technology. Our lead investigational drug candidate is rusfertide, which is also known as PTG-300. It is a synthetic mimetic of the natural occurring hormone hepcidin. Hepcidin regulates iron homeostasis and controls the absorption, storage, and distribution of iron in the body. Based on the data from our 70-patient phase 2 trial, the FDA has allowed us to move forward with our phase 3 trial for patients with polycythemia vera. And this trial has already begun. It's currently enrolling. We plan to have 100 sites and hope to enroll about 250 patients. This study allows for both high-risk and low-risk PV patients to enroll. It is a randomized placebo-controlled trial whose goal is to evaluate the safety and efficacy of a once-weekly subcutaneously self-administered dose of rusfertide in PV patients. Rusfertide or placebo will be added on to your current PV treatment, so patients on cytoreductive therapy can also participate. We have a patient website out there for this trial where you can see if you qualify for the study by answering 9 questions. It'll also show you the cancer centers that have the study open near you. The website is www.polycythemiavera-clinicaltrial.com. And I want to thank Anne and her team for hosting this educational MPN program and allowing me to speak on behalf of Protagonist Therapeutics.
Well, thank you very much. And we were going to have someone from Cartos who is unable to be with us today. I want to thank Laura Michaelis and all of our industry partners for joining us here today, and those that were not here, thank you so much. This would not be possible without your help. And of course, Mallory Tim, who is my associate director, who hands me questions throughout these programs and who sets them up. Thank you to her, and have a great day. And we'll be back on March 16th, my mother's birthday, with Dr. Ritchie. Ellen Ritchie will be with us talking all about ET. So don't forget to join us for that one. Thank you so much and have a great day.